We are going to discuss today an important aspect of Indian history. The topic of our discussion is nature of Indian polity in 18th century. Now, why we have selected these for today's discussion? Primarily the reason is, if we look the textbook written 5 to 10 years back, we generally find that there are the two major landmarks in Indian history. One is the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, which is considered as the process of disintegration of the Mughal Empire, and then 1757, which also falls in 18th century, which was the Battle of Plassey, which basically paved the way for the coming of the British and establishing their control gradually over India. Now, in between, the period is projected as a period of political instability, political anarchy. But we do not agree with this presentation of Indian history, and researches on Awadh, on Bengal, on Maratha state amply make it clear that there was the regional polity which was emerging as a strong force in most of the regions in India during this time. It is true that the Mughal Empire, which reached its culmination in the 17th century, and even under Aurangzeb, its boundary extended to the Deccan and other parts of India, but gradually the process of disintegration started, but that does not show that with the fall or with the process of disintegration that Indian polity was in a state of crisis or chaos. It precisely depends on how you interpret it. We find that there is a visible and viable sign of new kind of polity which was emerging in the 18th century in the form of regional powers like Bengal, Maratha, the Awadh, and also in Punjab the Sikh state. These are all powerful states. But before going into the details of this discussion, I would like to take you back to that what precisely happened to the mighty Mughal Empire in the close of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century that basically caused the process of its disintegration. With me today in the discussion is my colleague Dr. Sangeeta Pandey, and I would like to know from Dr. Pandey that how she would like to reflect on what generally is interpreted as the process of decline or disintegration or rather crisis of the Mughal Empire, right?
Thank you, Professor Basu. As you all know that Mughal Empire declined around 1707 after Aurangzeb's death. But this process of decline was a very slow process. It was not it was a process which was spread over many years. It didn't collapse all of a sudden in the year 1707, although 1707 has been demarcated as a line which is generally referred to as the period when it totally was in tatters and ruins, and after which it existed no more. But recent research has shown that this period of decline this crisis had started much earlier in the 17th century. Now we will basically before going into the discussion of how it declined, we would like to first emphasize what was the basic structure of the administration in the Mughal Empire. Now basically the Mughal system rested on the two pillars of Mansabdari and Jagirdari. This was the bureaucratic and military system which had been developed and which had been consolidated by Mughals right from the time of Akbar, but we find that during the time of Aurangzeb it showed signs of crisis. Now what were these signs of crisis? It is important to understand. Now, before going into that, we have to understand what was the Mansab system and what was the Jagir system, which developed the signs of crisis, which ultimately led to the fall of the Mughal Empire. Now, the Mansab system, as you must have read in your textbooks, was basically based on ranking. Mansab technically means rank, and Mansab system was a military system in which two types of ranks, the Zat, which meant the personal rank, as well as the Sawar, which meant the number of troops a Mansabdar had to maintain, were included in this category. And these two ranks were important for a Mansabdar, and that is what basically constituted the Mansabdari system. Now, the Mansabdars were paid in the form of either cash, but generally they were assigned Jagirs for as remuneration for the services they rendered to the Mughal power. Now, these Jagirs were located in different parts of the empire, and these Jagirs were basically they were termed as Tankhwa Jagirs. Now, in the period 18th century, basically with the expansion of Mughal power in the Deccan, we find that the number of Mansabdars in the Mughal service increased, because the Deccanese were also incorporated into the Mughal service. So, we find that although there was increase in the number of Mansabdars because of the expansion of the empire, but the number of Jagirs was limited, because the number of land which could be assigned for the remuneration to these Mansabdars was limited. So, since this land was limited, there was shortage of Jagir lands. So, the Mansabdars had to be paid either in cash or had to be paid in cash. There were no Jagirs. The number of lands which could be assigned in Jagirs was limited. So, this was the crisis which developed, and we find that basically in this period, this was the main reason why there was a crisis in the Mughal Empire. There was another reason why the crisis developed. Now, we find that in the Mughal period, there was the various areas, they were divided into parganas and villages and sarkars. These were the basic territorial divisions of the Mughal Empire, and we find that at the local level, the zamindars were very powerful. They were the main revenue collecting agency in the Mughal Empire, whereas at the level of the province, there were the Jagirdars. So, there were always clashes between the zamindars and the Jagirdars, and the zamindars at times they resisted the move of the Jagirdars to realize maximum revenue from them. So, this was this and the peasants were exploited by the zamindars. So, this kind of tripolar relationship between the peasants, the zamindars and the Jagirdars, it created a kind tensions within the at the local level. So, we find that the revenue which was to be sent to the treasury slowly and steadily declined when the central power or the central authority weakened. So, during the time of Aurangzeb, we find that there was weakening of central authority, and there were rebellions by the zamindars, there were rebellions by the local agents who collected the revenue. So, these things could not be, these vociferous tendencies could not be contained, and that is why the whole structure we find collapsed, and we find reflection of it in the various provinces which emerged after the death of Aurangzeb. Especially we find in Bengal how the zamindars became powerful at the cost of the Jagirdars and the Mansabdars.
Dr. Pandey, you have very well explained that the nature of crisis that the Mughal Empire was facing, starting from even say the end of the 17th century, and more precisely with the death of Aurangzeb. And the point which you have focused, if I have understood it correctly, that it is basically related with land and revenue administration, because the empire was basically dependent on the collection of revenue, and to maintain the army at the strength, they basically gave the ijara land. In the form of the Jagir, but then the land was not in surplus which could be distributed, but definitely the strength of army was increasing, right? So now what we are finding, that on the one hand there was the decreasing number of amount of land to be distributed as Jagir to the Mansabdars, and on the other hand taking the weakness of the central authority, the Jamindars, those who are in touch with the local peasants, they were extracted from the peasants as much possible to give to the Jagirdars or the Mansabdars. So the pressure is on the peasants, and peasants were not in position to pay as much as the expectation was from the Jagirdars. So this created a kind of tension at the grassroots level, and which gradually was increasing and boiling it to the crisis of the Jagirdars and the Mansabdars. And what happened following this crisis, we find that at the region level, at the provincial level, in some provinces, as you have given the example of Bengal, we find that Murshid Quli Khan was sent basically as a good revenue administrator in the early 18th century in 1705 or 1707. Gradually he emerged as the most strong local agent of the Mughal administration and consolidated his position in the region. And I think this same pattern is repeated in Awadh also, in Hyderabad also, right?
Yes, that's true. But in Bengal, we find that the Nawabs also, the governors, they other than the land revenue which they remitted to the central treasury, they were exploiting the peasants by imposing additional cesses called abwabs, and that led to the ruin of the crisis of the and that was led to distress among the peasants. So these things also are important, because the central power is weakening, and now there is no central check over these local provincial officials. Earlier, when the central power was strong, they could at least keep a check over these provincial and local officials. But now, since the central power is weakening, so that is why there is no check. So they are adopting these kind of resorting to illegal extractions from the peasants. And these kind of instances are also noticed in other states also, in Awadh also, in Hyderabad also.
So from this discussion, what emerged basically is this, that the mighty Mughal Empire, which basically dependent a class of military officials as well as the revenue administrators, taking the weakness of the Mughal authority at the center, gradually they were consolidating their position at the provincial level.
Yes, that's true.
Because they were in direct touch with the local jamindars and the local agents, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So this pattern precisely was emerging in the 18th century, and as a fallout of this, we find in three major Mughal provinces. What are the three? One is Bengal, one is Awadh, and the third is Hyderabad. In these three restwhile Mughal Empire, Mughal provinces of the Mughal Empire, we find the emergence of local authority. In case of Bengal, we find that the Murshid Quli Khan was basically appointed as a revenue administrator. Gradually, he also became the Diwan as well as the Najim
or the
Subedar of the province. And thus, combining the two positions, he became the absolute authority at the local level. And his position, though it was not hereditary, but basically the man selected by him was the successor to the throne. And he was in direct link with the Jamindars, and the various Jamindaris also emerged, and they also equally become powerful, and also on behalf of the Murshid Quli Khan and then Aliwardi Khan and then Sirajuddaulah, they were managing the scene. One is this revenue collectors in the form of Jamindars or the agents, and other interesting phenomena was the emergence of the merchants. because they were equally also becoming an important part of the polity in the 18th century. In the case of Bengal, we find the Jagat Sheth's family. When the conspiracy was going on in the Bengal Nawabs with the East India Company, this merchants played an important role in selecting who would be the successor to the throne. So basically it is linked to the economy, and economy basically was in the control of those who had the military strength in his control. So in this form we find taking the opportunity, we can say, of the weakening of the Mughal authority without denying the Mughal authority. They were in the process of consolidating their own control at the regional level, and this was the story in the case of Bengal, this was the story in the case of Hyderabad, this was the story in the case of Awadh. In all these three erstwhile Mughal provinces, they still now 1740s or say 1750s, they were acknowledging the Mughal authority, but in absolute terms they were basically ruling as an independent provincial lord.
For example, Murshid Quli Khan, he remitted around 1 crore to the central treasury after he became the Nazim. So this remittances continued, but we find that during the time of Ali Vardi Khan, especially during the Maratha attacks, attack or invasion of Bengal, we find that the remittances had stopped. So he might have taken this as an excuse not to pay to the central treasury. So basically these subedars, they were always looking for those chances when they would not make the remittances. They wanted to amass fortunes for themselves also. So this was the situation. We find that one author, Philip Calkins, he points out that he refers to these zamindars as well as the bankers as the regionally oriented ruling elites in Bengal. These were the persons who were really controlling, who had or who possessed power in Bengal in the 18th century. The merchants, the bankers, and the zamindars, and the landed elites or the zamindars, because you find very powerful zamindaris emerging in Bengal. Around 4 zamindaris were very extensive, as you must be knowing.
Yes, Nadia, Bardwan, Rajshahi, these are the examples where the zamindars were also emerging as very powerful local rulers.
Almost Rajas, they were referred to as Rajas. Rajas were stronger than zamindars. So ordinary zamindars.
So Dr. Pandey, this is one pattern which was predominant, that the empire was becoming weak and the provinces, they were gradually consolidating themselves in their respective areas as an independent authority, not completely defying the Mughal emperor. On the other hand, we find another group of states which was emerging, that is many historians describe them as the rebel states, particularly the reference is given of the Sikhs and the Marathas. Now what happened to the Marathas? As you all know that the Maratha, particularly they were very predominant under the leadership of Shivaji, and then after Shivaji, his successors, though there were for a time being the conflict between who will succeed to the throne, but basically they were carving out their own chiefdom in the state of Maharashtra, and there are the powerful elites at the local level, village level, at the provincial level also. And the most interesting part of this 17th and 18th century polity in Maharashtra was that there are the principalities, and as you all know that these are called the confederacies, like in case of Gaikwad of Baroda, then the Holkars of Indore, then the Scindias of Gwalior and Ujjain, and then the Bhosles of Nagpur. Who were they? They were basically the local landed gentry, you can say also the elite, who were controlling the local revenues and also the militia. and they were supporting the Maratha state, and at the center we find the most important position which was emerging was of the Peshwaship, and which is basically the prime minister of this confederacy. And this Peshwa became important and ruling with the help of these principalities, the Gaikwads, the Bhosles, the Scindias, the Holkars. Now, particularly from 1740s to 1761 till the third battle of Panipat, Maratha power was such strong that they were tried to extend their hold beyond the boundary of the Maharashtra, and the Maratha armed bands raided Bengal, raided Orissa, raided Gujarat, raided Rajasthan. What was the motive? Motive was to collect the Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi. That will provide you the protection, but you have to pay us the revenue, and in some cases it was 1/4, in some cases it is 10 to 12%. That was the assurance. In case of Bengal, we know that Alivardi Khan could buy peace, agreeing to pay an annual lump sum amount to the Maratha lords. So Maharashtra, we find a picture where the different principalities like the Baroda, like the Gwalior, Scindia, like the Nagpur, Bhosles of Nagpur, they were controlling the local revenue administration as well as the military, and they were providing support to the Peshwa, and with their help they become a power to be reckoned with the Mughal authority. But unfortunately, after the third battle of Panipat, they failed to maintain their strength, and gradually a situation come with the coming of the British in the scene. In 1802, they entered into a subsidiary alliance with the British, because always there was the conflict within the confederacy also, and the main issue of conflict was the issue of succession, because hereditary succession was not the right. In some cases there was the challenge to the this rule of hereditary. So internally they became weak, and the situation emerged in 1802 with the coming of the East India Company, or the emergence of the East India Company as a strong force at the all India level, that they had to enter into a subsidiary alliance. The other strong rebel state during the 18th century was the case of Punjab. What happened to Punjab? We know that before the emergence of Punjab as a strong state under the able leadership of Ranjit Singh, it was basically divided into 12 missals. Missals means the territories. In each missal there was a lord, or whom we can consider as the most powerful person who has the control over the local land revenue and the local armbands. Now these 12 missals which existed before the emergence of Sukarchakia missile, whose leader was the Ranjit Singh as the new founder of the Punjab state, they were ruling their independently their respective missals. But Ranjit Singh, with his able organization, collection of revenue with his own system, which has the reflection of the Mughal system of revenue collections, he consolidated his position and emerged as the most powerful leader in Punjab, and that is how Punjab emerged as a state where religious identity played a significant part in the consolidation of the political authority. So Maratha and the Punjab, these are the cases which are referred as the rebel state. There was another small state, the Jat kingdom of Bharatpur, which was not in nature of an extended territory, but the Jats were also equally powerful, and they were at a point of time the major source of strength to the Mughal emperor. But in case of this region from Agra to Delhi, they emerged as a strong force, and they established their kingdom in Bharatpur, which was also a powerful kingdom during the 18th century. So this is another pattern. First pattern we have seen, basically those who are earlier the Mughal provinces like the Bengal, Awadh and Hyderabad. The second is the rebel state. In this category we come across the Maratha, the Sikhs in Punjab and the Jats in this part of Agra to Delhi region, western in part of Delhi. And the third category is the new states or the new kingdoms, in which we can give reference to Mysore, where Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan emerged as the powerful ruler. We can give reference to also Travancore, and the most important is the case of Mysore, because you know that how both Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan was a major challenge to the expanding authority of the East India Company. They did not surrender to them, and they introduced the military and revenue administration in a way which was a departure from the Mughal system. So they also learned from the British the art of modern warfare, and they tried to organize their army along the line of the English organization of the army. So Mysore became a strong force in the 18th century under the leadership of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Beside this major states, we have a number of references where we find that the small principalities, but they were not the big ones, but they were powerful enough to have their control at the local level, but none of these states defied the authority of the Mughal emperor till this period in 18th century. But that was the nominal suzerainty they accepted, but in practice completely as an independent ruler they ruled their respective states, but there was no interlinkage among them, and that was the opportunity which the English East India Company basically utilized to extend their authority in India. Because we find that one after other they were acquiring the territories, but though in some cases we find there is a confederacy. When Bengal was attacked, the Nizam went in rescue, but ultimately he failed. Then we find in the Karnataki wars there are the internal Indian rulers who were siding with the East India Company rulers. So basically they took advantage of the local conflict and consolidate their positions. So the picture what we get is that on the one side is the gradual weakening of the Mughal authority, not the complete decline. On paper, still all the state ruler, they were acknowledging the Mughal emperor as the emperor of India, but in reality we are finding that at the provincial level, at the regional level, many new states were emerging, and there are the different pattern of the emergence of these rulers, and that is how the 18th century is full of political activity rather than a picture of anarchy, a picture of political instability which we get. It is instability in a way that the Mughal empire was declining, but on the other hand, if we look at it, that challenging the Mughal authority, not in theory but in practice, these provincial rulers were trying to establish their independent authority in their respective area. So the other important point which we have to look into it, one is the emergence of this regional polity, other is how they were managing their own province in terms of revenue administration, in terms of military, in terms of day-to-day administration. Do you find any continuity with the Mughal practice, or they tried to introduce changes in their own way in their respective area of authority? That is the point I would like that Dr. Pandey would try to give her views, that how different historians, different scholars try to look at this point from the point of continuity and change. Just
Yes,
2-3 references.
Professor Basu, you are right. Actually, these Mughal provinces they followed many practices of the Mughal administrative pattern, but there were certain dissimilarities also in the system which they evolved in their provinces according to the changing situation, according to the situation as emerged in the various provinces where they were situated. For example, in Bengal we find that talukdars are emerging. In Awadh also we find the emergence of talukdars, who are the revenue contractors. Earlier we find that in the according to the Mughal, classical Mughal pattern, you have the Jagirdars who are responsible for revenue collection from the various provinces. But here in these states, the Jagirdars and the Mansabdars, their powers have been crushed and curbed, whereas the Ijaradars or the Talukdars or the revenue contractors, they are emerging powerful, and the Subedars, they are themselves, they are leasing out the rights to rights of revenue collection to these people, because now the Mansabdars, who are the representative of the central Mughal power in the provinces, their authority has been subdued by the Subedars. So now they have to rely, they have to create a new kind of system for themselves, which is more loyal to them as far as revenue collection is concerned. And we find the emergence of various new offices also in these provinces.
So basically the point which emerged from this discussion is that though there were the cases where we find that the Mughal officials were continuing, but at the same time we find that the new experiment is also made, and you have given the example in Bengal. So what basically determined the local need, the local political convenience of the provincial ruler? So we cannot make a generalized kind of statement that with the decline of the Mughal authority, the Mughal practices overnight declined or got abolished in the provincial polity, but we find the history shows that in many cases the old practices continued, but at the same time we find that the new experiments were also made. Why? The reason being how to manage, one, the local revenues, the other how to take care of the different interests of the local elite or the local gentry. Because in the case of the Mughals, we have seen that the Mansabdari and Jagirdari were the two pillars on which that the Mughal empire was built. Now in the case of the provinces, the Mansabdari and the Jagirdari were no longer the important positions. In place of that, we find in some cases that the Talukdari system is emerging. The example given by Dr. Pandey is of the Daftardars or Amils in Hyderabad. So new offices were introduced to take care of the interests of the local gentry which were emerging. The other important point, particularly in the case of 18th century regional polity, as I referred earlier, is the interest of the local merchants. Merchants were emerging as a strong force at the local level. In case of any need of the ruler, they were the people who were providing the money in the form of through hundis and others. Now when they were controlling the resources, definitely they also want to have their say in the succession of rulers. So the merchants were playing a significant role in the polity of the 18th century. But in all these states in 18th century, we find though the system of the Mughals continued along with the new changes that they made by the respective rulers, whether the case of Maharashtra, whether the case of Bengal, whether the case of Punjab, because in Maharashtra we find the Deshmukhs and Deshpandes, the Kulkarnis, they were becoming very powerful, and clan-wise they were the Brahmin families who were basically the strength for the Peshwa in ruling the Maratha state. So this social ethnic composition also played a part in some state to control the political authority. But what we find that different states presents to some extent a different picture depending on the local revenue collection, the local social compositions and the local need of the peasantry and the gentry. But the emergence of the English East India Company more pronouncedly after the Battle of Plassey 1757 onwards, we find that the new chapter opens in 18th century politics. You all know that how the English East India Company succeeded in subduing the authority of the earlier trading companies from Europe in India. There were the Portuguese, there were the Dutch, there were the French. They have their independent colonies and factories in different part of India, but it was ultimately the English East India Company, and in some cases they have to face the stiff competition from the French East India Company, but ultimately they were succeeded in getting hold over Bengal in 1757 after the Battle of Plassey, and more decisively after the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Though basically they were the trading company, but the commercial interest of the English East India Company was very much protected by the British Crown, because this was the phase when the mother country, means England, needed raw material as well as the market for the industrialization, the process which had already started from 1750s in England. So they started to consolidate their position in India, and that was another predominant characteristic of 18th century polity. The process which started from Bengal, gradually it moved towards the east and north, and then they moved towards the south and the west. Within a period of 100 years, virtually by 1850s, we find that all over India they were able to establish their complete authority either through an alliance or through a victory over the local ruler. The question that comes, that why such a vast territory with such vast land resources, natural resources and powerful army they failed before the English? The answer that is generally given, that the division within the Indian polity in the form of the clash of interest and the localism, the provincialism, that was a predominant phenomena with the declining authority of the Mughal emperor, paved the way for the British, and the British played one local ruler against the other gradually, so that they could consolidate their authority over the Indian territory. This is the picture which we find in the 18th century, and by 19th century it is more or less clear that the British is going to rule over us maybe for another 100 years. So if we look back, we find that there are the crises, there are the problems, but the 18th century in no way can be considered as a period of anarchy, as a period of instability, as a period of economic decline. Economic viability was there, political potentiality was there, but what was lacking was a centralized authority. Before that, we have a strong Mughal emperor who could control the other parts, other provinces, but gradually when we find that we are approaching the 18th century, Aurangzeb's death get a new dimension to the centralized polity, provincial polity becomes powerful. So 18th century can be considered as a period when the central or imperial authority becomes weak, the provincial polity becomes strong, and the internal conflict within the different provincial powers became an important phenomena which ultimately weakened the Indian ruling class and paved the way for the coming of the Britishers. And anything that Dr. Pandey you would like to make as a concluding remark?
You have summed it up in a very precise way, that 18th century earlier by historians it was regarded as a dark age basically, but now with new researches, especially from Hyderabad, archival studies and others.
And the Richard Barnett study of Awadh.
Barnett study of Awadh and Bengal, Philip Karkins and Kiran Leonard, she has worked on Hyderabad political system.
That's true.
So all these researches have brought to light, and C.A. Bailey's study on northern India, townsmen, bazaars and men, all these studies point out.
The ongoing study of the Maratha confederacy, 18th century Maratha
so
policy.
all these recent studies which are based on archival material, they have brought forth this viewpoint that which was held by earlier historians, that with the decline of the Mughals everything collapsed. Now we have a different viewpoint, that it was not a dark age and it was not a decaying age. It was an age which was full of political activity, full of economic activity. But the only thing was that the imperial Mughal power which bound the various provinces was not there, and there were various provinces which were emerging as independent powers and autonomous principalities, and finally they were subjugated by the British, which you have rightly pointed out.
So it was a crisis if we look at from the Mughal perspective, because the Mughal empire was declining, but it was not a crisis if we look at from the perspective of the emergence of the regional
principalities.
Regional
new forms were developing in the provinces, new administrative practices emerged, new offices emerged, all these things were emerging,
and which were having the signs of future development,
which had the potential for future development.
The conclusive remark which we can make is, we should look the 18th century not from the perspective of a crisis, but from the perspective of the new beginning of a polity.
New beginning of
new polity
with great potential. So,
thank you.
Thank you.